Jephthah was a warrior born of disgrace and rejection, yet he attained greatness. Cast out by his own half-brothers because his mother was a prostitute, he fled to the land of Tob, where outcasts like himself gathered around him. Despite his troubled past, Jephthah's strength and leadership began to shine, and when the Israelites found themselves under the brutal oppression of the Ammonites, they turned to the very man they had once driven away. Desperate for a leader, they begged Jephthah to return and lead them into battle, offering him the role of their chief if he could secure their victory. When the Israelites found themselves oppressed by the Ammonites, the elders of Gilead realized they needed a strong leader to save them. They called on Jephthah to lead the Israelites into battle. At first, Jephthah reminded them of how they had cast him out, but eventually he agreed to their request after they promised to make him their leader if he succeeded. Before going into battle, Jephthah tried diplomacy. He sent messengers to the king of the Ammonites, asking why they were attacking Israel. The king of the Ammonites responded that Israel had taken their land when they came out of Egypt. Jephthah refuted this by explaining that Israel had not taken the land from Ammon, but from the Amorites, and that God had given Israel the land. Despite his arguments, the king of Ammon refused to listen. Jephthah then prepared for battle. Before the fight, he made a tragic vow to God, promising that if God granted him victory, he would offer as a burnt offering whatever came out of the door of his house to greet him when he returned. Jephthah then led the Israelites to victory, defeating the Ammonites. When Jephthah returned home, the first thing to come out of his house was his only daughter, dancing with joy to celebrate her father's victory. Jephthah was heartbroken but felt bound to keep his vow. His daughter accepted her fate but asked for 2 months to roam the hills and weep with her friends, as she would die without marrying. After 2 months, she returned, and Jephthah fulfilled his vow. The Bible does not specify whether Jephthah actually sacrificed his daughter or whether he dedicated her to a life of perpetual virginity, but the story stands as a sobering warning about making rash vows. After the victory, the Ephraimites, another Israelite tribe, confronted Jephthah, angry that they had not been called to fight the Ammonites. A conflict arose, and Jephthah's men defeated the Ephraimites. This civil strife cost 42,000 lives. Jephthah judged Israel for 6 years before his death, leaving behind a mixed legacy of leadership, military victory, and personal tragedy. Jephthah's story raises significant questions, particularly about his vow and the apparent outcome. God's law in the Old Testament explicitly forbade child sacrifice, especially the practice of offering children to the pagan god Molech. This prohibition appears multiple times, such as in Leviticus 18 and Deuteronomy 12, where God condemns the abhorrent practice and declares it an abomination. Throughout the Bible, God's character is consistently revealed as just and merciful. He condemns the sinful practices of the nations surrounding Israel, including child sacrifice. The silence of God in Jephthah's story, neither approving nor explicitly stopping the vow, might reflect the consequences of human choices, even when those choices go against his will. It's possible that the story of Jephthah serves as a narrative of human tragedy, illustrating the dangers of making impulsive vows and the devastating results of misunderstanding God's nature and commands. The vow came from Jephthah himself, and it seems likely that it was made in haste, without fully understanding its consequences. In this view, Jephthah's tragic decision does not reflect God's desire, but rather a human error made without fully considering the implications. Another interpretation, supported by some scholars and Jewish tradition, is that Jephthah did not actually offer his daughter as a burnt offering, but rather dedicated her to lifelong service to God. This would mean she remained a virgin for the rest of her life, which would have been considered a significant sacrifice, particularly in ancient Israel, where marriage and childbearing were highly valued. This view suggests that Jephthah kept his vow without physically sacrificing his daughter, aligning the story with God's prohibition of human sacrifice. Some theologians argue that Jephthah tragically misunderstood the nature of God and his commands. Nowhere in the narrative does the Bible say that God commanded or approved of Jephthah's vow or its fulfillment. Despite being a judge and military leader, Jephthah came from a troubled and outcast background, including his time spent among pagan influences. His understanding of God's character may have been influenced by the surrounding cultures, which practiced child sacrifice. Therefore, the sacrifice of his daughter could be seen as a grave mistake rather than an act condoned by God. He may have wrongly believed that offering a human sacrifice would be pleasing to God, even though this went against God's law. Jephthah's vow may have been misguided and not aligned with God's will. His understanding of God's mercy and provisions in the law may have been clouded by a transactional view of divine-human relationships, reflecting a belief that God required extreme actions in exchange for victory. This view emphasizes the cultural and moral distance between God's perfect law and the flawed practices of the people. Vows were taken very seriously in ancient Israel, and to break one would have been seen as a serious offense. Jephthah might have felt that breaking the vow would anger God even more than fulfilling it, particularly if he believed that his military success was contingent on that promise. It's also possible that Jephthah's deep sense of personal honor or obligation led him to carry out his vow even at the cost of his daughter's life. He may have believed that there was no honorable way to back out, especially after achieving such a decisive victory. If you have watched this far, please like this video and consider subscribing to our channel so we can bring you more interesting content. Now back to our story. Furthermore, there were provisions in the law of Moses that allowed for the redemption of vows. For example, in Leviticus 27, there is a detailed description of how people, animals, or property dedicated to God could be redeemed by paying a certain price. This provision allowed for flexibility in fulfilling vows without necessarily leading to harmful consequences, such as the offering of a human life. A person vowed to God could be redeemed through a financial payment based on their age and gender. For instance, the valuation of a female between 5 and 20 years old, which would likely be the age bracket of Jephthah's daughter, was 10 shekels of silver. However, having spent much of his life outside of mainstream Israelite society, he might not have been familiar with or aware of these redemption laws, leading him to believe that he had no choice but to carry out his vow literally. Jephthah may have felt bound by honor or fear to carry out the vow to the letter, not realizing that redemption was an option. Thus, theoretically, Jephthah could have redeemed his daughter by making this payment, sparing her life, or dedicating her to temple service instead of literal sacrifice. The story of Jephthah, despite its tragic and complex elements, carries several lessons and applications that can be relevant to our lives today, especially in matters of faith, decision-making, and understanding God's will. Here are some key takeaways. Firstly, Jephthah's rash vow demonstrates the importance of being thoughtful with our words, promises, and commitments. The story teaches us not to make promises in moments of desperation or emotional intensity that we may later regret or struggle to fulfill. Jesus himself warned against making hasty vows in Matthew 5, where he encourages people to let their yes be yes and their no be no, emphasizing honesty and simplicity in speech without the need for oaths. In our own lives, we should be cautious about making promises or commitments we cannot keep, especially in spiritual matters. This includes decisions about relationships, work, and personal integrity. Instead, we should pause, pray, seek counsel, and trust God to guide us through tough circumstances without resorting to drastic or harmful choices. Secondly, Jephthah's misunderstanding of God's character led him to believe that God would be pleased by a human sacrifice, something God never desired. The Bible consistently teaches that God is merciful, loving, and does not delight in extreme sacrifices or human suffering. Jephthah's failure to know God's nature led to unnecessary tragedy. Today we have the full revelation of God's character through Jesus Christ and the Scriptures. This story calls us to deepen our understanding of God's true nature, His love, justice, and mercy, so we don't fall into similar misunderstandings about what God requires of us. It encourages us to study the Bible, seek God's will in prayer, and live with a correct understanding of his nature and commands. By doing so, we can avoid unnecessary mistakes and ensure that our choices align with his will. Additionally, Jephthah's story shows us that even when we make rash commitments, there are often redemptive options available as provided by the law of Moses in Leviticus 27. Jephthah may not have understood that his vow could be redeemed, leading to the tragic outcome. God provides us with grace and wisdom to correct our mistakes or walk back from harmful promises. When we realize we've made a poor choice, instead of feeling trapped by it, we should seek God's wisdom and redemption. We should not feel bound to harmful promises, but rather trust in God's grace to find a way forward. This also applies to times when we've committed to something that conflicts with God's character or biblical principles. Finally, while Jephthah demonstrated faith in God by stepping into leadership, his story also shows the weight of responsibility that comes with faith and leadership. Leaders, whether in families, churches, or communities, are called to act with wisdom and integrity. As leaders or influencers in any capacity, we must strive to align our actions with God's will. Leadership involves not only trusting God but also acting with discernment, ensuring that our decisions honor God and protect the people we serve. Whether leading a family, a business, or a ministry, we should lead with humility, wisdom, and dependence on God's guidance. In conclusion, Jephthah's story is a sobering reminder of the consequences of rash promises and the importance of understanding God's character and his desires for us. It teaches us to approach God with humility, seek his guidance before making major decisions, and trust in his grace when we've made errors. By learning from Jephthah's mistakes, we can live with greater wisdom, integrity, and alignment with God's will in our daily lives. Thank you for watching. For more incredible and awe-inspiring stories on Bible characters, please like this video, share and subscribe to Faith Reflections 247. Stay blessed.